Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going to unpack a term we hear, well, constantly in the news: refugee. But what does it truly mean? Historically, legally, and maybe most importantly, what does it mean for the actual individuals it describes? We've pulled together a really fascinating exploration from our sources for this. And our mission today really is to cut through some of the noise, clarify these evolving definitions, trace this long history of forced displacement, and try to understand the complex realities, the challenges, and the rights of people seeking safety around the globe.
Yeah, it's a critically important discussion because this isn't just about, abstract legal concepts or cold statistics. It's really about the evolution of an international understanding. It's deeply intertwined with human rights and, well, the shifting landscape of global events. As we connect the dots here, I think you'll see just how far-reaching and impactful this topic truly is. It stretches from, ancient traditions of sanctuary right up to modern geopolitical crises.
Okay, so let's start with the modern definition. Where do we begin? According to the UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, a refugee is someone forced to flee their own country and seek safety somewhere else. They can't return home because of a, quote, well-founded fear of persecution. And that persecution could be based on things like their race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. Or it could be because of armed conflict, violence, or serious public disorder. Now, it's really important to remember this. Until someone is formally granted this status, they're often called an asylum seeker.
Right, that distinction between an asylum seeker and a refugee is vital, absolutely vital. And it's equally crucial to differentiate a refugee from an internally displaced person, an IDP. The key difference is, well, pretty simple, actually. An IDP has not crossed an international border. Even if their reasons for leaving home are identical to a refugee's, that border crossing is key legally. What's also interesting is how the word itself has evolved. Refugee comes from the old French word refuge, meaning hiding place, right? Ultimately from the Latin fugere, to flee. Historically, the term first pops up, referring to French Protestant Huguenots. They were escaping Catholic persecution back in the 1500s, 1600s. Then by World War I, it broadened out to basically encompass any civilian fleeing home from conflict.
So that 1951 UN convention, that set a crucial baseline, didn't it? Focused on that individual persecution aspect.
Yeah.
But you're saying as global conflicts and crises evolved, so did the understanding of why people flee. What was the driving force behind these significant expansions to the original definition?
Precisely. You hit it. These subsequent conventions, particularly the regional agreements like the 1969 Organization of African Unity, the OAU Convention, and the 1984 Latin American Cartagena Declaration, they fundamentally broadened the scope. It was a big shift. They recognized that it's not just about targeted individual persecution anymore. It's also about widespread violence, war, external aggression, occupation, foreign domination, or, events seriously disturbing public order. That kind of systemic breakdown. This was a crucial shift, I think, moving from defining a refugee primarily by who was persecuting them to also acknowledging these broader systemic breakdowns that create refugees. It offered protection to far more people. Even the UNHCR itself, since around 2011, explicitly recognizes those fleeing serious and indiscriminate threats to life. And you see similar things in the EU with subsidiary protection for those fleeing war, even if they don't meet the strict 1951 definition.
Okay, so with all these nuances and definition, it feels like there are different ways people move through the system. We hear terms like resettlement, integration, relocation. How do we categorize those processes?
Right, good question. Let's clarify those. Refugee resettlement, that's an organized assisted transfer to another country, a third country usually. Whereas refugee relocation tends to mean a non-organized transfer, often initiated by the refugee themselves. Then you have refugee settlement. That's more about the basic short-term adjustment, getting settled right. Things like finding housing, meeting initial needs in the new country. But refugee integration, that's the bigger picture. It's a much broader, dynamic, long-term process. It means becoming, ideally, a full and equal participant in the receiving society. It covers social aspects, cultural adaptation, structural things like legal rights, learning the language, building connections, and importantly, securing meaningful employment. We sometimes call that specific part refugee workforce integration, matching skills and providing security.
This modern legal framework, though, it didn't just appear out of thin air. Forced displacement isn't some new phenomenon. It's a thread woven deep into human history, isn't it? Let's maybe unspool that thread a bit, trace how the very concept of sanctuary has evolved. The idea of offering sanctuary, a safe place, it goes way back, ancient Greeks, Egyptians, and it started to get codified, put into law in the Middle Ages with the right to seek asylum in holy places like churches. And here is a subtle but I think crucial historical shift. The very idea of a country of nationality as we understand it today, where your identity is strongly tied to a specific nation state and its borders, that really solidified with Romantic nationalism in the late 18th century. Before that, seeking sanctuary wasn't always about crossing a clearly defined international border in the same way. But this new concept of nationhood, it made border crossing and identification, well, an integral part of the refugee experience we see now.
Indeed. History is absolutely full of examples of mass displacement long before we had formal international refugee law. You mentioned the Huguenots, hundreds of thousands fleeing France after 1685. Then think about the over 2 million Russian Jews emigrating due to pogroms between, say, 1881 and 1920, or the 2.5 million Muslims who arrived in the Ottoman Empire as refugees between the Crimean War and WWI. The League of Nations in 1921, that was really the first attempt at international coordination for refugee affairs. Fridtjof Nansen, the Norwegian explorer, quite famous, was appointed High Commissioner. He initially assisted about 1.5 million people fleeing the Russian Revolution. Many of them became stateless when the Soviets revoked their citizenship. A huge problem. Nansen's mandate quickly expanded, though. Beyond the Russians, it grew to recognize the plight of other groups facing mass displacement, including over 1 million Armenians fleeing genocide and later Assyrians and Turkish refugees. This period kind of cemented the idea that refugee status could be granted to specific designated groups in dire need. And the Nansen Passport, that was a travel document for refugees, it was so impactful, so important. That Nansen's office, the Nansen International Office for Refugees, was actually awarded the 1938 Nobel Peace Prize for it.
Wow. And then came the seismic shifts of World War II. The rise of Nazism drastically increased the number of refugees from Germany, especially Jewish refugees, who were stripped of citizenship by the 1935 Reich Citizenship Law. Thousands found refuge initially in places like France and Palestine before Britain closed Palestine to Jewish immigration in 1939. So, by the end of WWII, Europe faced an unbelievable situation: over 40 million displaced people. Just imagine that. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRRA, was set up. It managed to return about 7 million people home and establish camps for around 1 million who refused repatriation, often fearing persecution back home. But this period also saw these immense, often tragic population movements. You had the largest population transfer in history, affecting some 15 million ethnic Germans. Over 2 million are thought to have perished during expulsions from eastern provinces after the Potsdam Agreement in 1945. Millions of former Russian citizens were forcibly repatriated to the USSR under the Yalta Agreement, often to face imprisonment or death. Poles and Ukrainians were transferred between newly drawn borders. And of course, the displacement of 700,000 Palestinian Arabs who fled or were expelled during the 1948 Palestine War, the Nakba.
Yeah, and to kind of conclude that tumultuous period, the International Refugee Organization, the IRO, was founded in 1946. It took over from UNRRA. And while it did successfully resettle about 1 million refugees, it controversially and significantly excluded persons of German ethnic origin. Even though that group actually outnumbered all other European displaced persons combined at the time, this really highlighted the limitations, maybe the political nature, of these ad hoc responses. And it clearly paved the way for needing more permanent, more universal structures.
That exclusion, it sounds incredibly significant and really highlights the need for something more consistent. Which brings us to the UNHCR, right? Created in 1950, that's the primary international body today, protecting and supporting refugees globally, working towards these durable solutions we'll get into. But here's something that might surprise you, listening. Not all refugees actually fall under the UNHCR's mandate.
That's right. And it leads us directly to the unique case of Palestinian refugees. The United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, UNRWA, was established back in 1949, even before UNHCR, specifically for Palestinian refugees displaced by the 1948 conflict. Now, UNRWA's classification criteria are unique. They include descendants of the original 1948 refugees, regardless of whether they've gained citizenship elsewhere. This is quite different from the UNHCR definition and practice for other refugee groups. And it's meant the number registered with UNRWA has grown from around 750,000 initially to over 5 million today, across 7 decades. And these refugees, many still living in camps generations later, face ongoing struggles. UNRWA focuses on providing essential services like education, healthcare, and shelter in its areas of operation.
Okay, so we have these large organizations. Where do refugees actually live? The common image is often refugee camps, right? But you're saying that's not the full picture.
Not at all. Actually, a significant number, more than half globally, live in urban settings, in towns and cities, not in camps. Camps are generally designed for acute, temporary accommodation, often in emergencies. But the reality is people often end up staying for many, many years, sometimes decades. And camp life brings serious risks, disease outbreaks, lack of opportunity, vulnerability to exploitation, even recruitment into armed groups for children sometimes.
So given those challenges, what are the long-term goals? What are these durable solutions the UNHCR aims for?
Right. The UNHCR framework focuses on three main durable solutions. First is local integration. This means providing refugees with permanent residency and, ideally, the chance for naturalized citizenship in the host country. We've seen examples like Tanzania granting citizenship to a large number of Burundian refugees back in 2014, or Mexico naturalizing Guatemalan refugees. The second solution is voluntary return, or repatriation. This has to be based on a free and informed decision by the refugee that it's safe to go back. We've seen large-scale returns over the years, Congolese refugees returning to the DRC, Angolans going home after their civil war, Afghans returning from Pakistan, Iraqis from Syria, though sometimes returns are complex or premature. The third option is third country resettlement. This is that assisted transfer to a safe third country we mentioned earlier. Historically, it was often seen as the least preferable solution, maybe because it involved moving people again. But honestly, for many refugees in protracted situations today with no prospect of return or local integration, resettlement has increasingly become the only solution, the only path to a stable future.
Okay, so let's walk through the process. If you're seeking protection, you apply for asylum, right? You become an asylum seeker. And the process to determine if you qualify for refugee status, that's called refugee status determination, or RSD. That seems crucial. Once that status is granted, what rights do refugees actually have?
Yeah, this raises a really important question. What rights kick in? The 1951 Refugee Convention outlines specific rights, like the right to work, access education, social welfare, and, importantly, the right to travel documents, the convention travel document. But there are fundamental rights that are even more basic, that underpin everything. The most critical is the right to non-refoulement. This is an absolute right. It's really the foundation, the bedrock of international refugee law. It means you cannot be returned, forcibly sent back to a place where you face serious threats to your life or freedom, where you risk persecution. And crucially, this is considered customary international law. That means it's binding on all states, whether or not they've even signed the Refugee Convention. It covers both direct return and indirect return, like sending someone to a third country that will then send them back to danger. That's sometimes called chain refoulement. So non-refoulement ensures you're not sent back into the fire, essentially.
That makes sense. What about other rights?
Well, there's the right of return, often discussed in relation to refugees wanting to go back to their original homes eventually. This can be incredibly complex, especially regarding property. Think about disputes over land ownership in places like Afghanistan, Colombia, Rwanda after mass displacement. Who owns what now? It gets very difficult. Family reunification is also a key principle, recognized as a valid reason for immigration in many countries, allowing families separated by flight to be together again. And, as mentioned, the right to travel, using that convention travel document, though notably not usually back to the country they fled from. Then there's this often debated concept of restriction of onward movement. Sometimes it's controversially called asylum shopping. The idea promoted by some states is that once a refugee finds safety in one country, they shouldn't then try to move on to seek asylum or better prospects in another safe country. But, for many refugees, seeking protection elsewhere isn't about shopping. It might be about joining family members, finding a place where their specific skills are recognized, accessing better long-term integration support, or simply escaping precarious conditions in the first country of asylum. So the notion of what constitutes an adequate safe country is often challenged by the lived realities of refugees.
Okay, so we've covered the legal definitions, the history, the frameworks, but these are ultimately about individual human suffering, aren't they? Let's move beyond the paperwork and the history books for a moment. Let's confront the profound, often invisible challenges people face when forced to flee. First, you mentioned this earlier, but for many, displacement isn't temporary. It's a long-term reality, not a short-term crisis at all.
Exactly. That's what we call protracted displacement. It's a huge issue. UNHCR figures suggest 2/3 of refugees globally are displaced for over 3 years. And about half, think about that, half are displaced for over 10 years. Think about the human cost there. It's not just lost potential. It's lost years, lost dignity, lives in limbo. This often leads to what some researchers call the canvas ceiling. It's like a glass ceiling, but for refugees in camps or marginal situations. It's this metaphorical barrier where skills atrophy, qualifications become outdated or unrecognized, professional networks disappear. This makes that workforce integration we talked about incredibly difficult later on, even if opportunities arise. It really highlights the need for long-term aid strategies that go beyond just immediate humanitarian release, focusing on education, skills maintenance, livelihoods.
And it's not just economic hardship or loss potential. Health is a major concern, too. Refugees typically report poorer health outcomes, don't they? Beyond the obvious physical wounds from conflict or flight, mental health seems profoundly affected.
Absolutely. The mental health toll is immense. Rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, are alarmingly high. Studies have shown, for example, very high rates in Palestinian children exposed to conflict, or among Bosnian refugee women who survived the war. Research suggests refugees resettled in Western countries can be about 10 times more likely to suffer from PTSD than the general population. This can lead to depression, anxiety, and tragically a high suicide risk. Then there are physical health issues often exacerbated by displacement. Increased susceptibility to infectious diseases like malaria is a big one. This can be due to factors like lack of previous exposure and therefore immunity, combined with conditions in camps, dense populations, poor sanitation, sometimes environmental changes near camps like vegetation removal near rivers, which can increase mosquito breeding sites. We saw this with Afghan refugees in Pakistan, for instance. It's a tragic irony, isn't it? After escaping war or persecution, a disease like malaria can become a major killer, especially in crowded, unfamiliar environments. Simple interventions like insecticide-treated bed nets have proven very effective, but access can be an issue. And general access to healthcare is often a major hurdle. Barriers include language differences, cost even if healthcare is theoretically free, administrative complexities, lack of information, sometimes discrimination. Policies vary hugely. Canada might have bureaucratic hurdles. Australia might focus on cost constraints for temporary visa holders. What's fascinating, though, is some research, for example, in Germany, actually found that restricting refugees' access to preventative or early health care ended up increasing overall healthcare expenditures later on. Because delayed care often leads to more serious conditions requiring more expensive acute treatment down the line. It's counterintuitive, but important.
That's a really crucial point about the long-term costs. Sadly, this extreme vulnerability being in a new place, often terrified, maybe not speaking the language, it makes refugees prime targets for exploitation too. That's a truly dark consequence of displacement.
It is. Exploitation is a grave and constant concern. We have documented cases, reports from reliable organizations showing human rights violations, things like child labor, debt bondage, severe mental and physical trauma inflicted by smugglers or even authorities, and sadly, widespread sexual exploitation. Children and women are particularly vulnerable. There have been horrific reports over the years, for instance, of young girls in some West African camps being forced to exchange sex for basic necessities, like food or soap. And more recently, during the mass displacement from Ukraine, there were immediate and significant concerns raised by international bodies about the high risk of human trafficking, particularly targeting women and unaccompanied children. Now, this vulnerability, it sometimes gets twisted. It raises an important question, or rather, addresses a persistent narrative. The idea that refugees somehow pose a major security threat, or that they commit crimes at higher rates than native populations, it's a narrative you hear a lot in political discourse. However, the empirical evidence, the actual data, largely contradicts this. Study after study in different countries generally shows little evidence of higher crime rates among refugees. Sometimes the rates are even lower than among native-born populations, particularly for violent crime. The narrative about refugees being a Trojan horse for terrorism, particularly Islamist terrorism, is also largely debunked by facts. For example, one analysis looked at about 800,000 refugees vetted and admitted to the U.S. between 2001 and 2016. Only 5 were later arrested on terrorism-related charges, and none had actually carried out a deadly attack in the U.S. Similarly, in Germany, out of around 600,000 Iraqi and Syrian refugees arriving in 2015, only 17 were investigated for potential ties to terrorist groups by early 2016. The vast majority of jihadist terrorists in Europe have actually been homegrown citizens. The statistical risk is minuscule. One think tank calculated the chance of an American dying in a terror attack committed by a refugee as about 1 in 3.6 billion per year. Compare that to, say, 1 in 113 dying in a car crash. So the insight here isn't just that the narrative is wrong, but that our fears are often wildly misplaced. And this distracts from the very real threats refugees themselves face. Refugees are often at high risk of being targets of hate crimes and anti-refugee violence. This often functions as a scapegoating mechanism, particularly in response to unrelated security crises or economic anxieties, as we saw with attacks on refugee housing in places like Sweden after the large influx in 2015.
That's a really stark contrast between the perception and the reality. Stepping back a bit, some experts argue that refugees, just by their existence, highlight what one called a breakdown of the nation-state system. They show us the limits of our current global structures, where belonging is tied so tightly to citizenship in one particular state. And here's another crucial point, I think, that often gets overlooked. The way we talk about and portray refugees can have unintended consequences, can't it?
Absolutely. It's a really important point about representation. There's what some academics call the universalizing effect of the term refugee. While using that single term can aim to inspire broad empathy and humanitarian response, it can also inadvertently silence individual stories. It can erase the specific political context, the historical factors, the unique reasons why different groups were forced to flee. Everyone gets lumped together. So there's a vital need to acknowledge refugees' own narrative authority, their historical agency, their political memory, to listen to their understanding of their situation. We saw a tragic example of this with Rwandan refugees in camps in the Congo after the genocide. UN officials sometimes downplayed refugees' fears about returning based on official assurances of safety from the new Rwandan government. But the refugees themselves often have very specific, credible fears based on their local knowledge and political memory, fears that tragically proved founded when some returnees faced reprisals. Their narrative authority wasn't sufficiently respected. On the education front, which is related to agency and future prospects, refugee children often face immense hurdles. Many have experienced traumatic events, witnessed violence, lost family members. This trauma can directly lead to learning impediments, concentration problems, anxiety. Plus, they face practical obstacles. Frequent disruptions to their schooling during flight, limited access to quality education in camps or host communities, language barriers, sometimes cultural clashes with unfamiliar education systems. I read about Somali Bantu students resettled in Chicago, for example, who initially struggled even with basic classroom tools like pencils and notebooks because they were so unfamiliar. Overcoming these obstacles requires really thoughtful strategies, respecting cultural differences and learning styles, individual welcoming efforts from schools and communities, proper support and training for educators, student-centered teaching methods, focusing on relationship building, and crucially, supporting native language development alongside learning the host country language. It all helps build confidence and capacity.
It really underscores the need for tailored, long-term support. So bringing it all together, when we look at the sheer numbers today, what picture emerges of the global scale of displacement? How big is this?
The scale is, well, staggering, and it's been growing. By the end of 2020, the UNHCR estimated a global total of 82.4 million forcibly displaced people. That's a record number. Now, to break that down for you, that includes 26.4 million refugees people who crossed an international border. It includes 4.1 million asylum seekers people waiting for a decision on their refugee claim. And a massive 48 million internally displaced persons, IDPs, people forced from home but still within their own country's borders. A significant chunk, about 68%, over two-thirds of refugees under UNHCR's mandate originated from just 5 countries. Think Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, Myanmar. Often places with protracted conflicts or severe human rights crises. And another key point, the vast majority, around 86% of the world's refugees, are hosted not in wealthy Western nations, but in developing countries, often countries neighboring the crisis zone. Turkey has been the top host country for several years now, hosting around 3.7 million refugees, mostly Syrians. Back in 2015, during the peak of the Syrian crisis moving into Europe, the total number of displaced people worldwide hit 65.3 million, which was a record high at the time. Syria alone accounted for 4.9 million refugees then. And a heartbreaking statistic from that time, 51%, more than half, of all refugees globally in 2015 were children under 18. And of course, the most recent major displacement event shaking the world is the 2022 present Ukrainian refugee crisis. We've seen unprecedented speed and scale, over 8.2 million Ukrainian refugees recorded across Europe, plus an estimated 8 million more displaced internally within Ukraine itself due to the Russian invasion.
Wow. Those numbers are just immense. We've covered so much ground today, from the surprising history of the word refugee itself to the intricate legal definitions, the vital work of the UN agencies, and perhaps most importantly, the profound and varied challenges faced by millions worldwide forced from their homes. It's a truly complex landscape, isn't it? Constantly evolving. But at its absolute heart, it's about individual human lives, people seeking safety, seeking dignity, seeking a future.
It really is. And maybe this raises a final important question for you, the listener, to reflect on after this deep dive. How might our own understanding or perception of refugee change? What if we focus less on just the legal label, the category, and focus more on the individual journey, on respecting the narrative authority of each person forced to flee? acknowledging their unique history, their political memory, their individual reasons and experiences, rather than relying on a single, often flattening, universalizing image. What might change then?